poetry is not innocent. All regimes need their poets to guide the unconscious of its subjects. Fascisti, futuristi, marinetti knew all about that aesthetical necessity. Some would say he defined it, insofar that he wrote its manifesto. But the imperialism of corn is older than the Programma di San Sepolcro. And since the Americans inherited its mindset, its aesthetic truths, if you like, from the British rather than the Italians, we would do best to quote Lord Byron to set the tone of what actually goes on below those artificial flowing fields touched by, as Sting put it, the western wind, the gold of which makes even the sun jealous. In 1816, the Tomboro volcano erupted in the Nusa Tenggara Islands, protesting the inhuman cruelty of the Dutch East Indies, which had been robbing the spice for its own people's new holiday dishes for centuries. Its impact was so immense that on the opposite side of the world, it was remembered in that same Europe as the year without a summer. And many apocalyptically feared that this would be the last harvest. One of those who feared was Lord Byron. Quote, "I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. Rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went, and came, and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this their desolation, and all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light. And they did live by watchfires, and the thrones, the palaces of crowned kings, the huts, the habitations of all things which dwell, were burned for beacons. Cities were consumed, and men were gathered round their blazing homes to look once more into each other's face. Happy were those who dwelt within the eye of the volcanoes and their mountain torch. A fearful hope was all the world contained. Forests were set on fire, but hour by hour they fell and faded, and the crackling trunks extinguished with a crash, and all was black. The brows of men by the despairing light wore an unearthly aspect, as by fits the flashes fell upon them. Some lay down and hid their eyes and wept, and some did rest their chins upon their clenched hands and smiled, and others hurried to and fro, and fed their funeral piles with fuel, and looked up with mad disquietude on the dull sky, the pall of a past world, and then again, with curses cast them down upon the dust, and gnashed their teeth and howled, the wild birds shrieked, and terrified did flutter on the ground, and flapped their useless wings. The wildest brutes came tame and tremulous, and vipers crawled and twinned themselves among the multitude. Hissing but stingless, they were slain for food, and war, which for a moment was no more, did glut himself again. A meal was brought with blood, and each sate sullenly apart, gorging himself in gloom. No love was left, all earth was but one thought, and that was death immediate and inglorious, and the pang of famine fed upon all entrails. Men died, and their bones were tombless as their flesh. The meager by the meager were devoured. Even dogs assailed their masters, all save one, and he was faithful to a course, and kept the birds and beasts and famished men at bay, till hunger clung them, or the dropping dead lured their lank jaws. Himself sought out no food, but with a piteous and perpetual moan, and a quick desolate cry, licking the hand which answered not with a caress, he died. The crowd was famished by degrees, but two of an enormous city did survive, and they were enemies. They met beside the dying embers of an altar place, where had been heaped a mass of holy things. For an unholy usage they racked up, and shivering scrapped with their cold skeleton hands the feeble ashes, and their feeble breath blew for a little life and made a flame, which was a mockery. Then they lifted up their eyes as it grew lighter, and beheld each other's aspects, saw and shrieked and died. Even of their mutual hideousness they died, unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written, Fiend. The world was void, the populous and the powerful was a lump, seasonless, herbless, treeless, manless, lifeless, a lump of death, a chaos of hard clay. The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea, and their masts fell down piecemeal. As they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead, the tides were in their grave. The moon, their mistress, had expired before. The winds were withered in their stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to the Return of the Repressed. I am your host, Marcus, and I am happy to sit down on my cushion with you again to talk about some things. Really? Keeping that? What was stressed in the last episode, the link between biomedical science and agrobiological science, is less difficult to conceptualize when one realizes that the big ag corporations are also the big pharma corporations, since their sub-microscopic wars of maneuver and position to patent dimensions of nature are today one and the same. We have seen how ever since the nascent IG-Farben corporations first unleashed the odic force by synthesizing molecular strings out of fossil fuels in the early 19th century, these seemingly separate apparatuses have been chemically intertwined to make drugs, fertilizers, biocides, a new periodic system of salt and crystal, needed to make processed industrial food, commodities worthy of the shelf life of capital's footprint, simultaneously walking backward and forward in the chronologically organized corridors of that museum soon to be built by the communist ghost of Christmases yet to come. Despite the focus on Luigi, even from deeply investigative angles, it is seldomly mentioned that United Healthcare, for example, have bragged a lot about their various quote-unquote food as medicine projects that they started during COVID. And that's their own title, not some hippie tagline that I came up with, should someone roll their eyes out there, having stumbled upon this podcast by mistake. According to one of their press releases, they have begun investing in quote-unquote mobile food pantries for quote-unquote home-delivered meals, which they seek to stock with quote-unquote medically tailored food boxes and other quote-unquote emergency food provisions. Our big pharma, big ag, big food link is perhaps most evidently constituted in our everyday life through the semi-obligatory use of preservatives, the various E's, as it were, the sugar substitutes, the antioxidants, the emulsifiers, the gelling agents, the colors and colorings, not to forget the many flavor enhancers that in a direct, non-metaphorical, Pavlovian way makes cats behave as if they prefer Whiskas over Royal Canin, or humans McDonald's over Burger King, or vice versa. Some might say that it's the ideological family apparatus which is the most influential in these settings. That's why it's extra interesting to see United Healthcare state that, quote, while our funds generally go towards providing fresh foods, we worked with these organizations, during COVID I might add, to distribute food with a longer shelf life so that they could offer emergency food boxes for curbside pickup, end of quote. It is interesting to see just how many of these chemicals were actually already first made by that initial Wotan doctor, Baron Karl von Reichenbach, who coined the term eau de force in 1845, which he is presumed to have got from his lengthy studies of Swedenborg and Mesmer, and which to him explained in a philosophico-alchemical way how all this chemistry made possible the animal magnetism, as they shepherd us back to the comforts of chemically induced irrational instinct. There was no IG Farben back then, but these were very precisely the processes which made IG Farben to what it was. And just like Ford, Rockefeller and Carnegie, etc., had the educational apparatuses of Caltech and Columbia, so too did IG Farben have their Kaiser Wilhelm Society, and the Zaibatsus of Japan, their greater Unit 731 complex, designated to make sure that their recruited big ag and big pharma scientists could work in the same building and share lunches in the same cafeteria. Not an inherently bad thing in any way. Exchanges of ideas across superficial walls of compartmentalization shall be encouraged also in communism, said even Lenin. But the difference is, of course, the private nature of something that should be public, insofar that it concerns itself with the general intellect. And we might stop to wonder at times, as I do during my frolicking in the forests of these mountains. How is it that when the Green Kaiser Wilhelm Society and Unit 731 paperclips dossiers arrived in America, why did they end up in, for example, Caltech rather than at, let's say, the USDA? Why so many private rather than public benefactors of the conclusions of the Alsos reports? Well, insofar as agricultural research goes, I have explained some of the reasons in my earlier Bio, Peace and Warfare series, but tonight I have, as always, an extended backdrop story which most of you have probably never heard about. Which means we will stay in the 19th century, where we feel at home, which had dust bowls of its own, and in the next episode we will deal with the more famous dust bowls of the early 20th century. For you see, America's richest, as they slowly started to become the world's richest during the progressive era of the Gilded Age, had already back then begun shutting down and eventually co-opted what I have down in my paper as the biggest public programs of agricultural experimentation and seed socialization that the United States have so far ever seen. A federal program and state apparatus of research which in some ways had been an inspiration for the Kaiser Wilhelm Society's plant breeding. A lot of intellectual and organizational cross-Atlantic pollination, back and forth, I know. So let me try to make it clearer so that we can all understand how we ended up with King Corn. At the dawn of American anti-communism, when the Civil War produced, as a not all too unforeseen consequence, the American proletariat and the first national banks, hand in hand, to pay those proles, cast ready and minted for a new labor market. Back then, in the 1860s, the robber barons, who had seen what had happened in Europe some 2 decades earlier, in 1848, the year of revolution, started to get worried when Abraham Lincoln set up a new so-called, quote-unquote, People's Department. Some called it that with seeping irony, some with a certain noble visionary pathos. This was the Independent Department of Agriculture, which would one day become the USDA of today. And the worry that upset the industrialists and the classical landowners was that in 1862 it took over the Patent Office's seed duties. Upset them enough to shoot him 3 years later, you ask? Well, you'll have to draw your own conclusions later. I asked DeepSeek and ChatGPT, and they said the suggestion was absurd. But then again, people who think AI is actually intelligent are not very intelligent. And they seldomly ask themselves, though they know that slavery is bad, who actually owned the cotton seeds of the plantation owners' cotton, which the slaves picked on lands which was actually owned and belonged to indigenous people. People who once bred forth that amazing plant, as most crop wild relatives of 90% of the kind of cotton sold today are found in Central America. Cotton which then the East Coast merchants sold as export mass-produced clothes and cloth, so overproduced that the impoverished, factoryless weavers and tailors of the colonies had to eat that cotton before they starved. So even if Big Ag had something to do with Lincoln's assassination, this is not a simple story of good and bad, since Lincoln's 4 acts of Frontier Lebensraum, of which one was the aforementioned institutionalization of the USDA, which we will get into, makes him a possible candidate for one of the worst crimes against humanity in history. And though it would never had crossed my mind when I hung wheat bundles to dry on the countryside of Gyeongsang with Korean communists, I have to say, welcome back to the Return of the Repressed, dear listeners. And let's see if we can make some kind of a case for American federalism during this contemporary techno-feudal coup attempt. There once was a man called Daniel Chase, and his eyes had seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. And so he stuck a bayonet on his militia musket and rammed it through the heart of British imperialism. The red coat fell to the muddy ground of his farm as if the clothes had been worn by no one. A ghost manifested an inch above the top of the cloth bundle, dyed by matter. It quickly took on the appearance of a Boston banker. When the war with King George's armies was over, farmers who had fed the Continental soldiers saw these Boston men come and take their lands and cattle, saying they were calling in a debt. So the angry farmers went to the veteran soldiers, who were also angry, because despite all the talk of paying one's dues, many of them had not been paid by the new American government upon discharge, but instead given certificates for future redemption instead of immediate cash. Even though there had been 4 great national bank acts while they bled out on the fields in 63, 64, 65, and 66, which promised that this kind of wildcat banking behavior would be a thing of the past. One day there was a standoff outside the courthouse of unpaid debts in Hampshire County in Massachusetts. The judges of the bankers had gathered some 500 militiamen to protect themselves, knowing very well that their business wasn't popular. But an angry veteran turned armed farmer called Luke Day showed up with another 1,500 angry veterans turned armed farmers and told them there would be no debt collection today. The judges could do nothing but agree. As word spread of this people's victory, similar things happened in other places such as Forchester and Athol. In Great Barrington, the bankers managed to pay 1,000 militiamen to protect the courthouse. But when the town square filled up with protesters, the mob asked the militiamen which side they stood on. Someone shouted something like, "Step to the right if you're a bootlicker who loves to take orders from the bankers, or step to the left if you are with us, we the people of the town square." 200 of the militiamen stepped to the right, 800 to the left, and the judges adjourned. The crowd then broke open the county jail and set free the indebted. A county doctor, who was also the chief justice, with his heart in the right place, unlike the bankers, said, quote, "I have never heard anybody point out a better way to have their grievances redressed than the people have taken." End of quote. The governor and the political leader of Massachusetts became alarmed. Samuel Adams, whose beer was the first American beer I ever tried, and which I think is really quite good, was once looked on as a radical leader in Boston. But now, taken by the dark forces of capital, he insisted people act within the law. But it was too late, for word spreads quickly when the bankers lose the mandate of heaven. In Rhode Island, the debtors had taken over the legislature and were issuing paper money. In New Hampshire, several hundred men in September of 1786 surrounded the legislature in Exeter, asking the taxes be returned and paper money issued. Because whatever libertarians might tell you, gold tends to only be a freedom for those historical blocks with a traditional reserve of wealth. The red cadres of the Long March on the other side of the planet would a century later be in a very similar position to their comrades of Massachusetts. and found that they had much more use of their money printing presses than they did of heavy metal bullion. Our hero, Daniel Chase, joined some days later on September 19th of that year, when the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts met in Forchester and indicted 11 leaders of the rebellion. Indicted, including 3 of his friends who were found to be, quote, disorderly, riotous, and seditious persons who unlawfully and by force of arms prevented the execution of justice and the laws of the Commonwealth. End of quote. Perhaps Chase felt that he had just seen many long and gruesome years of his friends and family members killed in a brutal war against the Commonwealth. And here were now those who were supposed to have paid them for that, speaking instead from a place with a common ambition of wealth that remained the exact same as that which he had taken up arms to eradicate. As mentioned, Chase was like those held accountable, also a veteran who had left the army after not being paid 6 years earlier, finding himself in a court and later jail for non-payment of debts shortly thereafter. Not sure how they imagined that he would have paid it, seeing as he was fighting for them and not tending his fields, but the logic of these people, man. In solidarity with his friends, Chase organized 700 armed farmers, most of them veterans of the war, and led them to Springfield. There they found a general with 900 soldiers and a cannon. Chase asked the general for permission to parade, which the general granted. So Chase and his men moved through the square, drums hanging and fifes blowing. As they marched, their ranks grew. Some of the militia joined, and reinforcements began coming in from the countryside. Now, sorry, but since no one who listens to this show is a believer of last Thursdayism, we know that America did not go on to develop into a people's republic, and there was no immediate second American Revolution against the bankers of the New England. That is to say, unfortunately, the rebellion was crushed before it became a revolution, and on Judgment Day, Samuel Adams' ears went deaf listening to those who pleaded for mercy and gave history's most absurd and bloodthirsty reason for why the people of the United States had fought to overthrow the king of the British Isles. Quote, in monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. End of quote. Adam's bullshit asshole is where the grapes of wrath are stored. And while Chase managed to escape, a multitude of hangings followed. And so it came to be that a young nation was created to obscure the class struggle inherited in a dubious farmer's depth, passed on by the obelisk since time immemorial, which seemed to linger despite the absence of the English lords. The Marxist American historian Howard Zinn wrote in conclusion in his best-selling A People's History of America in 1980, quote, when economic interest... You say he's a Marxist? When economic interest... When economic interest is seen behind the political clauses of the Constitution, then the document becomes not simply the work of wise men trying to establish a decent and orderly society, but the work of certain groups trying to maintain their privileges while giving just enough rights and liberties to enough of the people to ensure popular support. The Constitution was a compromise between slaveholding interests of the South and moneyed interests of the North. End of quote. And that is why the Constitution of America, unlike the Declaration of Independence of America, says, quote, life, liberty, or property, end of quote, rather than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end of quote. Because it was felt that some armed farmers had misunderstood what was meant. Whilst the petty bourgeois classes, the bakers, the blacksmiths, brewers, ship joiners and shipwrights, co-opers, cartmen and tailors, all marched in the multiple thousands in New York to celebrate this clarification of the new constitution, for they really believed in property. A constitution which would protect the city dwellers against British imports, whilst they, as a class in return, protected the authors against the blacks, the Indians, and the poor whites, the ordinary laborer, the apprentice, the journeyman, and the armed farmers, etc. An English sweet candy deal that lasts to this day. And the deal was improved. The authors, worrying popular support was not cemented enough, despite the agreeable flag-waving of the urban petty bourgeoisie, added an amendment to increase it, hoping popular support would reach even the small and middle-sized landowning farmers. An amendment known as the Bill of Rights, which is where all the contemporary talk of freedom of speech comes from. And though it was said that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, etc. In just 7 years, in 1798, the Sedition Act made it a crime to say or write anything, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious, end of quote, against the government, Congress, or the President, with intent to defame them, bringing them into disrepute or excite popular hatreds against them. The American Revolution made revolution illegal. I have talked about how the very word sedition came to be in the English language during the Elizabethan era, during the cultural industrial birth of the first popular social media, i.e. theatre, Shakespeare, etc. In my Pinkerton episode with William from OAS Info Service, when the English Revolution made revolution illegal. Obviously, making it illegal to express the discontents of class struggle does not make class struggle disappear. It might even infuse it. And so we must jump forward to some of the first victories of the agrarian class as they made the state work in their favor. as I see it, the first victory of the agrarian class, when it made the American state work in its favor, would come a generation later, in 1823, when agricultural groups such as the South Carolina Agricultural Society first asked the Navy to collect seed that they could distribute to its members. It had already been a common exotic pastime for farmer boys who had to serve in the army, since sisters, nanas, and prospect girlfriends back home do not, with good judgment, want to hear stories about male camaraderie for days on end. So when it was formalized by the national government in 1836, the state officially began acquiring and distributing seed as the Commissioner of Patents, Henry Lewitt Ellsworth, started collecting foreign varieties from American officials and then distributing them to farmers through congressmen and agricultural societies. Despite the lure, we must keep in mind here the social democratic shortcomings of building welfare on the backs of subaltern American peoples, who at the time had their land taken away to be given to settler farmers as a bribe to neutralize the antagonisms that had flared up in Massachusetts when the constitutional deal was signed, not forgetting the enslaved millions who worked on large portions of that land against their will, carrying out the actual scientific breeding experiments. But we are, of course, not people to forget things like that when reminded. I will now quote at length from the excellent book Dust Bowls of Empire, Imperialism, Environmental Politics, and the Injustice of Green Capitalism, by one of James C. Scott's more Marxist students, compensating for his anarchist shortcomings, Hannah Holleman. Sounds like a German or Dutch name, so that's what I'll go with, who inspired the title of today's episode. This quote is long because it will explain a few things in the midst of my subpar prose, namely how modern American agriculture came to be, how the land that would give birth to King Corn was stolen from the Indians, who had stewarded it with fire, sensible natural farming practices, and wild herding since the last ice age. How it was raped and plundered in only a generation to cause the Dust Bowls. And most importantly, since this is in no way a finished chapter of history, begin to explain how the logic of ecofascism and green capitalism first started thinking about nature. Quote, Lincoln in his presidential campaign promised free acreage in the West, including the Plains region, to settlers. This moment marked an escalation of US government imperialist policies and practices. Following his victory in the election of 1860, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act in 1862, which required the military removal of the peoples living in the plains and elsewhere in order to allot land to settlers. And I'll add here, as does Hannah, a couple of hundred pages further into the book, that the Homestead Act was flanked by the Morrill Land Grant College Act, the act establishing the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as mentioned before, and the act granting federal lands and funds for the construction of the Union Pacific Central Pacific Railroad to connect the coasts and inland agricultural markets. As samsaric citizens of the flat circle, we have talked about all of these aspects before. How these Victorian holocausts were made possible by government policy, financing from the imperial urban centers, technological change and military conquest, how the railroads exported foodstuff and imported famine. So let's now also note that the College Act taught the students the tenets of surplus extraction, robbery agriculture, and how to forcefully widen the gap of the ecological rift. Learned with interest the ways that would rapture the metabolism of nature, and in the opened up, painful space of this split, Ezekiel saw the wheel. Quote, even before his election, the US Army had 6 of its 7 departments, quote within quote, stationed west of the Mississippi, a colonial army fighting the indigenous occupants of the land, end of quote, within the quote. When the Civil War broke out, the new president recalled federal troops to fight in the east. In their stead, volunteers assembled from the western states and territories carried on, quote within the quote, military campaigns against indigenous nations, end of the quote within the quote, constituting, quote within the quote, foreign wars fought during the US Civil War. But the end of the Civil War did not end them, end of the quote within the quote. After the Civil War, quote within the quote, the US Army hardly missed a beat before the war to win the West began in full force. As a far more advanced killing machine and with seasoned troops, the army began the slaughter of people, buffalo, and the land itself. End of the quote within the quote. The connection between destroying ecosystems and societies was encapsulated by the US military's indirect and direct actions to annihilate the buffalo in order to deprive Native Americans of both sustenance and culture. In charge of the Department of Missouri from 1869 to 1870, Lieutenant General John M. Schofield wrote succinctly of his aims, quote within the quote, I wanted no other occupation in life than to ward off the savage and kill off his food until there should no longer be an Indian frontier in our beautiful country. End of the quote within the quote. The settler occupiers carried on. As Dunbar Ortiz, the socialist activist who wrote An Indigenous People's History of the United States, as she writes, quote within quote, destroying the natural tall grasses of the plains and planting short grasses for cattle, eventually leading to the loss of topsoil 4 decades later. End of the quote within the quote. And yeah, I'll just add here, Marcus, again, she's referring to the more famous Dust Bowls that will come in a while. Going on with the quote in its entirety. In 1871, the US government passed legislation further attacking tribal sovereignty, stating that, quote within quote, hereafter, no Indian nation or tribe within the territory of the United States shall be acknowledged or recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty, end of the quote within the quote. During this same period, William Tecumseh Sherman, who replaced Ulysses S. Grant as the commanding general of the U.S. Army, quote within quote, sent an army commission to England to study English colonial campaigns worldwide, looking to employ successful English tactics for the U.S. wars against the indigenous peoples. End of the quote within the quote. By the 1890s, although military attacks still took place, as did armed acts of resistance, quote within quote, most of the surviving indigenous refugees were confined to reservations, their children transported to distant boarding schools, end of quote within the quote. However, political and economic elites supporting westward expansion in what would become the Dust Bowl region and beyond did not consider these actions against the indigenous nations adequate. Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes, who represented some of the most powerful manufacturers in the Northeast, and who had his own financial interests at stake, argued that the reservation system and all holdings of communal land were too socialist. He insisted, as colonial administrators around the world did during this time, using various rationales, that privatization and allotment of land to individual tribal members were necessary, leaving the remainder for US citizens to settle and paving the way for a massive land grab by the railroads and private capital more broadly. Dawes reported on his trip to Indian Territory and the Cherokee Nation to the Board of Indian Commissioners. Quote within the quote. The head chief told us that there was not a family in the whole nation that had not a home of its own. There is not a pauper in that nation, and the nation does not owe $1. It built its own capital, in which we had this examination, and built its schools and hospitals. Yet the effect of the system was apparent. They have got as far as they can go, because they hold their land in common. It is socialist writer Henry George's system, and under that there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization, till these people will consent to give up their lands and divide them among their citizens. Shut up, Max. So that each can own the land he cultivates. They will not make much progress. End of the quote in its entirety. And finally, as Hannah concludes, quote, property ownership for Dawes was necessary to instill, quote within the quote, selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization, end of the quote within the quote. And importantly, for Dawes' economic and political position, it satisfied the interests of private capital, especially the railroads, manufacturers seeking cheap raw materials, extractive industries, bankers, and land speculators. End of the quote's entirety. Which sometimes I feel bad when self-hating Americans always say settler colonialists, and it sounds like, I don't know, the Little House on the Prairie, even though that is a pretty horrible, heroic story in and of itself. But I mean, yeah, it is these people who are buying up the big chunks of land, right? I've said this before. I think that the Indian could probably have seen eye to eye with, a few, what's it called? Diasporic whites from the lands of Europe that they had already destroyed, because the Indians had taken such good care of their land, that I'm sure that their, humble, what is it called? Not gratitude. It's the opposite of gratitude, isn't it? Compassion, let's say, just simply put it like that. Their compassion would have accustomed a few 100,000 settlers. But when you start doing this with the railroads, the extractive industries, the bankers, the land speculators, and the manufacturers of cheap raw materials, well, you know who has come knocking on the door. It's not just the settler colonialists, it's the white devil. Now, so, children of the corn, of the scorched earth by the 4 acts of Abraham L. Behold, a white horse, for he who sat on it had a plough, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And the machine which he commanded denied that the only universal transhistorical reality of the human condition, as Karl Marx subsequently puts it in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, is that, quote, man must live from nature, i.e. nature is his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. End of the quote. Central to this dialogue is the labor process, which is, quote, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. End of quote. That is to say, through our labor as humans, we transform nature, and therefore ourselves. But still, let me now quote to you at length, dear listener, from Das Kapital, because of course that is why you came here. And that is, to be more specific, the very last paragraphs of the 4th part of the book, which deals with the production of relative surplus value, i.e. the 10th subchapter of chapter 15, with the best title of the whole book for all Warhammer 40k nerds out there, namely Machinery and Large-Scale Industry. Okay, here goes. Subchapter 10, Large-Scale Industry and Agriculture, so-called. Or rather, Große Industrie und Agrikultur. Auf jetzt, ohne Brille, Mann. Weil sicher ist sicher, ne? Gutes Entscheidung, Alter. Aber warum? Zitat. Die Revolution, welche die große Industrie im Ackerbau und den sozialen Verhältnissen seine Produktionsagenten hervorruft, kann erst später dargestellt werden. Hier genügt kurze Andeutung einiger vorweggenommenen Resultate. Actually, it's not gonna work. I can't just fucking sit there and read in German. Because so few people will understand it, and I find myself not quite understanding what I'm reading. So, let's continue in English, as much as I would like to do this in German. Maybe one day. Produktionsprozesse sind dem zugleich die Springquelle. Nein. Okay, in English then, to keep you properly up to date of what's going on right now. Once again, a text from before universal suffrage and electricity. Quote, the revolution called forth by large-scale industry in agriculture and in the social relations of agricultural producers will be investigated later on. Here we shall merely indicate a few results by way of anticipation. If the use of machinery in agriculture is for the most part free from the injurious physical effects it has on the factory worker, its effects in making workers redundant is more intense and comes up against less resistance. As we shall see later in detail, in the counties of Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, for example, the area of cultivated land has been much extended within the last 20 years, while in the same period the rural population has diminished, not only relatively, but absolutely. In the United States of America, the workers are as yet only virtually replaced by agricultural machinery, i.e., the machines allow the producers to cultivate a larger area, but do not actually expel any agricultural laborers employed. In 1861, the number of persons occupied in England and Wales in the manufacture of agricultural machinery was 1,034, while the number of agricultural laborers employed in using agricultural machinery and steam engines was only 1,205. In the sphere of agriculture, large-scale industry has a more revolutionary effect than elsewhere, for the reason that it annihilates the bulwark of the old society, the peasant, and substitutes for him the wage laborer. Thus the need for social transformation and the antagonism of the classes reaches the same level in the countryside as it has attained in the towns. A conscious technological application of science replaces the previous highly irrational and slothfully traditional way of working. The capitalist mood of production completes the disintegration of the primitive familial union which bound agriculture and manufacture together, when they were both at an undeveloped and childlike stage. But at the same time, it creates the material condition for a new and higher synthesis. A union of agriculture and industry on the basis of the forms that have developed during the period of their antagonistic isolation. Capitalist production collects the population together in great centers and causes the urban population to achieve an ever-growing preponderance. This has two results. On the one hand, it concentrates the historical motive power of society. On the other hand, it disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth, i.e., it prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal, natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. Thus it destroys, at the same time, the physical health of the urban worker and the intellectual life of the rural worker. But by destroying the circumstances surrounding that metabolism, which originated in a merely natural and spontaneous fashion, it compels its systematic restoration as a regulative law of social production, and in a form adequate to the full development of the human race. In agriculture, as in manufacture, the capitalist transformation of the process of production also appears as a martyrology for the producer. The instrument of labor appears as a means of enslaving, exploiting, and impoverishing the worker. The social combination of labor processes appears as an organized suppression of his individual vitality, freedom, and autonomy. The dispersal of the rural workers over large areas breaks their power of resistance, while concentrating increases that of the urban workers. In modern agriculture, as in urban industry, the increases in the productivity and the mobility of labor is purchased at the cost of laying waste and debilitating labor power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country proceeds from large-scale industry as the background of its development, as in the case of the United States, the more rapid is the process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, only develops the techniques and the degrees of combination of the social processes of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. End of the quote. And that chapter and subchapter and part of that book, the first volume of Capital, in its totality. Nice. return in the next episode to the biggest of the two major ideological mechanisms of mystification when it comes to the only acknowledged politico-economic wound on the social body that is the United States of America in the next episode. Namely, that it is printed, to my non-experiential knowledge, in the vast majority of American school books and its materials, that the Dust Bowls were unprecedented and unforeseen. We see already here that Marx is talking about this many decades and hundreds of moons before it happened. We will have other examples as well, and we will combine them with the myth-busting of some of the other mechanisms of forgetfulness, memory, and trauma inheritance manipulation in the next episode, as suggested. However, this entire subchapter, which I read to you in full, can be considered for simplification to altogether represent, as he says earlier in the chapter called Ware und Geld, commodity and money, and now I'll just do the one sentence to dot the I's, as it were, to fully accentuate that what the plow and wheels of the white machine horse is trying to deny us is, quote, the universal condition for the metabolic interaction, the stoffwechsel, between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence. End of the quote. As Hannah says, Marx was an early articulator of the paradox now routinely observed, that as our technological capability and scientific understanding of ecological crises expand, so do the crises themselves. Likewise, internationally speaking, in a broader sense beyond the colonization of America's First Nations, the seeds which the Navy collected on the shores of other continents were not, unlike the seed banks of the glorious Soviet Union, destined to eventually help those from whom it was taken, insofar that it was often stolen and robbed. But I will nonetheless, with some hesitation, bring all of these early days of the USDA up as a socialist victory in both theory and practice of sorts, since over the next several decades of the second half of the 19th century, investment by the national government in collecting and disseminating seed became commonplace. And most importantly, its distribution became once again a focal point for political disagreement between the upper classes and the small and middle farmers. And if state legislation upsets the robber barons and pleases the poorest, there is a good chance it contains a grain of socialism, even if the state is not under the control of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But there are other problems, as historian Kathy J. Cook has shown, for it is not entirely clear if what I am calling the socialization of seed distribution was designed only to help the farmers, or if we see already in the middle of the 19th century the first steps towards monoculturalization and monopolization. Quote, by 1861, the Patent Office distributed more than 2 million packages of garden and flower seed. The purpose of these distributions, as well as those by agricultural groups, quickly became muddled. Sometimes the goal was to test and spread new seed, but often the plan was to replace seed that farmers were already using. For instance, the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society spent $600 in 1855 on, quote within the quote, the purchase of a new, carefully selected wheat, Golden Drop, to replace the hopelessly dirty and mixed seed commonly sown, end of quote. The uncertainty of purpose, whether it was to support farmers and their current methods, or to foster change in seed and crops, increased when the United States Department of Agriculture dubbed the People's Department of Abraham Lincoln, was formed in 1862 and took over the Patent Office's seed duties. End of the quotes in its entirety. Now, most people who are not farmers don't understand why anybody would prefer quote-unquote dirty and mixed seed batches, end of quote, to the standardized, in this case, golden drop, carefully selected wheat, uniform as it is, etc. But as someone who has worked with people who do farm labor on the very threshold of subsistence and profit, often without heavy machinery, especially on the rice fields, where glue in a bag is still the biggest thrill of all among the friends of their kids, because they don't smoke marijuana in their colonies. They can't afford a trip on LSD. I'll tell you that the dirty mixing is what makes sure that the starvation does not immediately stand at the gates when surplus value fucks off. You have some things dying and you have some things surviving, rather than all things surviving and all things dying, as you would if it was more uniform and more pure and more well selected. Around this time then, the 1850s and the 1860s, the USDA dedicated itself almost full time to sending free seeds to addresses provided by congressmen. They did this because plant breeding was a time-consuming, high-risk activity. A new variety took years to develop with no guarantee of success in the capitalist sense. Therefore, the private sector initially shied away from plant breeding and seed of seeds. This practice in general is still the backbone of the world's food security and the gene bank behind all food, long before the corporations took over. Seed of staple crops such as cereals, rice and maize was still a business nightmare. Once a new variety was painstakingly developed and sold, there was nothing to stop the farmer from saving part of that harvest for next year's seed. In other words, the customer didn't have to come back again. And even worse, the farmer could freely resell the seeds in the pleasant warm autumn days before hybrid F1 corn, when nature was still inherently communistic. A Swedish researcher named Jens Nordqvist wrote in conclusion, and I'll paraphrase here, that it fell to the federal government to drive development, but in lacking the resources to process all the seeds that were flooding in, the government turned directly to farmers. Tens of thousands of letters and small packages of exotic seed varieties were mailed each year to farms in the various states. Like a giant blood transfusion, new biodiversity was pumped into the country. What's more, it was completely free for the recipients. The federal authorities did not charge for the seeds. The shipments also represented a kind of low-intensity and sustained political campaigning, because congressmen and senators could use their unlimited right to postage and thus send seeds free of charge to grateful voters in their home states. Farmers experimented widely with the seeds and developed a large number of successful varieties. A veritable army of tens of thousands of amateur breeders on farms across the continent planted and evaluated millions of seeds. Substandard varieties were discarded, while the more fertile ones were given a second chance the following year. As these immigrants adapted to the new land, the settlers in turn adopted the plants to their new soil. They created an American seed catalog with an ever-changing assortment of genetic diversity, and the results were spectacular, even though everyone involved were basically barefoot researchers, just like Lysenko, and not a single book had been written on genetics yet. Still pseudoscience, Marcus, you fucking commie. By 1860, the US was producing enough agricultural products to feed a population of over 30 million. The country could even export some of its surplus. The seed campaign reached its peak in 1897, when over 1 billion seeds were sent in over 22 million different shipments. An effort that cost the Department of Agriculture a third of its budget. And I'll do the anti-monocultural math for you, dear listeners, so that you can see what we have lost. That means that each shipment on average contained 45 seeds per batch. And that shoestring organization of the productive forces is how the US became the richest country on the planet. Which means, to all the young listeners, the prospecting and the older ones as well, who are already farmers, as long as you receive 45 seeds, heirloom varieties preferably, maybe even more preferably, some that can be provided from the still existing indigenous communities. If you just receive 45 seeds in this lifetime or in one project, you will still be part of this project of restoration and revitalization and regeneration. And ultimately, this is what will win against the monocultural corporations, because, as always, we are so many more than them. They do not have the capacity to do this. It costs too much for them to do it. It's simple math. It's simple capitalist logic. That's why they do what they do and we do what we do. However, by this time, what we today know as Big Ag had already formed, and together they established their lobbying group, the American Seed Trade Association, ASTA, in 1883. It was quite tricky to find out just who were among the first founding members, but a valid guess of mine is that it would have included Ferry Moore's Seed Company, which controlled Michigan and Massachusetts, founded in 1856. Burpee Seeds and Plants, which controlled Pennsylvania, founded in 1876. Gurney's Seed and Nursery Company, which controlled Indiana, founded in 1866. D. Landreth Seed Company, the oldest, founded in 1784 and in control of Vermont. Joseph Harris and Company, founded in 1879, controlling New York. Young and Company, 1867, which was the big dog in Wisconsin. Many of these seed merchants and bankers would, by the turn of the century, be among the world's biggest seed corporations, and in the 1920s, many of them would involve themselves in the early initial GMO research that we discussed in the Lysenko series. That is to say, X-ray mutation and carcinogenetic mutation with colchicine. Coincidentally enough, it was also at this time, after 40 years of lobbying, that they finally managed to shut down the federal program of seed distribution in 1924, 2 years before Mueller's groundbreaking so-called discovery of X-ray mutagenesis, and the same year that Trofim Lysenko's first scientific publication came to the attention of a journalist at Pravda. The first victory of ASTA came in 1893 during the peak years when their lobbying got J. Sterling Morton elected as the Secretary of Agriculture. Sterling Morton, according to his biography from the 1940s, was a member of a secret society called the Chi Psi Fraternity, the first American Greek letter fraternity to get a frat house. Initially founded by a man hanged to death for piracy in the 19th century, which I think is fitting considering the coming bio-piracy activities. A fraternity of the kind that has skull and bones on its emblem, just like their Yale brothers and the Gothic wankers in the Wewelsburg Castle under Himmler, and which can boast 2 CIA director memberships, as well as the Prince of Monaco, whose grandfather, I might add, is sometimes suggested to have created Interpol, as well as DeWitt Clinton Pole, the spy who was involved in the ambassador plot to assassinate Lenin. Morton was a Bourbon Democrat, that is to say, a laissez-faire capitalist who, ironically enough, seeing as he was made a Secretary of Agriculture, made a political career out of his personal anti-agrarianism, especially against the so-called country life movement, which in the first decades of the 20th century, just like the Lebensreform in Europe, sought to provide farmers with access to research, education, technical assistance, and rural electrification, before it was hijacked by the Nazis, that is. He believed seed distribution compromised politicians and farmers alike. He also emphasized harm to the seed trade, of course, asserting that free seed had, quote-unquote, outlived its usefulness, so that, quote-unquote, its further continuance is an infringement of the rights of citizens engaged in legitimate trade pursuits, end of quote. He says citizens, but he means corporations. Morton believed that, quote, seed firms would get plants into the hands of the growers 2 or 3 years ahead of the government, end of quote, and repeatedly defended the commercial seed firms from governmental competition. Yeah, just pulling this out of his ass. He's got no statistic on this whatsoever. He's shutting down, as we will see, the department that might have this kind of statistic. And he began by capping the salaries of women in the USDA by arguing that no woman was worth more than $1,200. And he also moved telephones out of offices and into corridors, literally just to mess with them. The down-on-the-floor practicality of filibustering, if you like. Misogynistic filibustering. Like, I believe women work worse, so I'm going to make their work conditions worse so that it will look like they work worse. Okay? As a big ag recruited infiltrator and saboteur, he also began massive underspending year after year as the Secretary of Agriculture, turning the department into the slow bureaucratic slug he claimed to be fighting, which is of course the oldest trick in the book among those of political power with a free market brain damage. In 1896, he left $60,000 unspent, which was more than a third of the budget which Congress representing the farmers had continually tried to increase. But despite all this, Morton and Big Ag could not get away from the fact that the American farmers still formed the backbone of its society. The problem for their capital market logic was that over time, agriculture became too successful. With USDA programs, increased knowledge, better seeds, fertilizers, as well as a new, more efficient methods and tools, such as tractors and combines, the American peasantry created a gigantic surplus. During World War I, the large stocks could be sent to Europe, which, as we have suggested before, created an agricultural frenzy in America. Farmers were able to sell virtually everything they managed to produce, and at increasingly high prices. Fueled by demand, many took out large loans to expand their farms or buy more land. But when the war was over and European soldiers traded rifles for pitchforks and returned to the fields, the bubble burst. Suddenly prices plummeted, and with them farmers' incomes and the value of their land. The American farmers were in the hands once again of the New England bankers and dubious Massachusetts Boston debts. So now Big Ag moved in for the final kill. The end of free common seeds would come under Henry Cantwell Wallace in 1921 to 1924 under Republican President Warren G. Harding. Henry Cantwell Wallace was the father of Henry A. Wallace, who would one day also become Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt, just like his father. Now, the Wallace family were big farmers, very big farmers, and Henry A. Wallace would, in 1926, 2 years after his daddy had successfully butchered the up until now biggest project for the socialization of seed distribution in history, go on to found the High-Bred Corn Company, today DuPont Pioneer High-Bred. The High-Bred Corn Company would create the first true modern monocrop, the first seeds that had to be bought again at the supplier year after year, since the second generation of F1 seeds are designed by purpose to be dog shit, effectively turning seeds into a commodity proper. This new system would play a substantial role in the Dust Bowls, both in America and later Kazakhstan, when it toppled Nikita Khrushchev. And as the syrup of this corn made its way into pretty much every product of the American supermarket, and the feed of pretty much all cattle and livestock, it would make the people of the richest country in the world the most fat and chronically ill. But more on that later.
worship Hozh.